Hey YouTube, today I'm going to try my best to convince you that the 808 kick drum is basically a rainbow in the audio spectrum. And I'm showing this Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album artwork because it's actually a perfect schematic for a sound design technique that I'm going to teach in this video. Dark Side of the Moon is one of the most recognizable album covers in the world, and I think Pink Floyd gets just about as much credit as your high school physics teacher for making it common knowledge of this physics concept of dispersion. And the fact that white light can be broken into separate colors using a prism is really super interesting. And I love how Dark Side of the Moon can be sort of thought of as an analogy for breaking down the human experience into different nuanced components. It's one of the best concept albums of all time, if you ask me. And I have recently been exploring a different analogy. How would this concept of dispersing white light into a rainbow apply to sound design? And while I was exploring this, it took me down a path of finding a way for making a kick drum that at least I have never seen before. And even though the process is very different from how an 808 synthesizer works, the end result is actually very similar. So I'm going to make the argument that the 808 style kick drum is the rainbow of the audio spectrum. Let me first give an example of the type of sound that we're going to make using this technique and an overview of the technique itself before I dive deep into each component and how it relates to the Pink Floyd album cover. So the basic pipeline is putting an impulse signal into a dispersion processor and resulting in a kick drum after some further processing and colorization. It sounds like this. It's, I think, totally usable as a EDM kick for just about any genre, and there's tons of ways you can tweak it to get really infinite types of samples with this process. Okay, so I've already shown you an example of the final result, but how did we get there? So the first question I want you to think about is, if we were going to model white light going into a prism, what would be the best audio waveform to model white light? And I think there's two possible answers, and one of them is more obvious, but the other one is actually going to work out better for us. So I think the more obvious answer is white noise. As you can see, I'm plotting the frequency spectrum here, and you can see it's a very broad source of noise. It's kind of full spectrum all the way from the low frequencies, 20 hertz, up to the high frequencies, and 20 kilohertz plus. So that's actually why white noise gets the name white, because it's similar to how white light contains all component frequencies in the visible spectrum. But white noise, you do have to average it out over a long period of time to get that like equal source of energy across the frequency spectrum. So I would argue this is more like a large column of white light going into a prism. And you actually want a narrow column of white light to go into the prism to break it into a very clear rainbow. With the large white light, what's going to happen is as the light is getting bent into the different colors through the prism, and the large column, it's basically like the far right side of the white column of the light is going to mix with the far left side, and in the middle of the rainbow it's going to be kind of a blurry whitish light, and towards the edges you'll get a rainbow. And that's kind of exactly what would happen if we put white noise into a disperser. So we really want kind of a narrow column of white light. And what would that be? So if I wanted to model a thin column of white light, I would actually use an impulse signal, which is just basically one single sample of sound that jumps up to its peak value, and it's at the zero crossing everywhere else. You just get all the energy focused at this one point. And if you didn't already know this, it might blow your mind that truthfully, mathematically, an impulse contains every single audible frequency. Every single one. It has an infinite amount of frequencies inside of it. And you might not believe me, our spectrogram will actually show it. It'll measure it. You can see since basically we get, as the impulse comes in, we get like a thin line that goes up all the way down from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. That's all the basically the Fourier transform saying that all frequencies are present in that short little burst of energy. So why is that the case? So I think it's very hard for most people to wrap their head around the fact that an impulse contains every single frequency inside of that one little blip of energy.
We should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing.
So I tried to create a visualization to help show that. I remember I saw a visualization like this in my college DSP class, and it really helped drive the point home or like make sense of it. And I actually couldn't find that type of visualization on the internet. So I thought I'd try and create my own. Hopefully you learned something useful from it. So what this animation on the right is showing is how we're approximating the impulse function by adding up a bunch of cosines. So it's basically like an additive synthesizer where there's all the partials of the additive synth, which are just made of cosines. They're all phase-aligned cosines, which is important. They need to be phase-aligned to create an impulse. And yeah, like as you start to add more and more partials, or more and more cosines across the audible frequency range, you wind up getting a better and better approximation of an impulse signal, which for me, it helps visualize how the cosine, like that's how you end up with that one spike of energy, is basically all the phase aligned cosines are equal to 1 at the origin, so that the average signal of them is also equal to 1. But everywhere else, all these these are not harmonic frequencies, right? These are just evenly spaced out across the audible frequency range. So there's inharmonic content going on, and all these different cosines, they actually start to phase cancel every single other place, like everywhere from time, all the time on the right side of the axis and all the time on the left side of the axis. There's just all the different cosines start to cancel out, and you get zero signal, but only at the origin, where just because these signals are phase aligned, you do get a little burst of energy. So hopefully that animation helps you visualize it. I've also showed the code here, like the amount of partials you need, or the amount of cosines you need to create an impulse is way more than an additive synthesizer will support, as well as, it's kind of like inharmonic versus harmonic content. So I really didn't have like a synthesizer that could show this. I had to go to use a Python script to create this. I hope that makes sense why I'm going to use an impulse signal to model the white light. And if you have any questions about it, just hit me up. I'd be happy to chat about it. But then the next question I want you to think about is, if the thin column of white light is going into a prism and the prism is going to break apart that white light into a rainbow, which audio effect would best represent this? So for me, the answer is dispersion. So let's see what this disperser plugin from Kilohertz does to our impulse signal. First, let's play the impulse signal on its own. And just like we saw before, it's a burst of all the frequencies at one moment in time. But now if we enable the disperser, you can see the frequencies, it looks like they're getting bent, like there's like a hockey stick shape to the kick drum. So what the disperser is doing is it's adding a delay, but it's a frequency dependent delay. So the lower frequencies are getting delayed more than the higher frequencies, and it's sort of a continuous dispersion or a continuous frequency dependent delay. So, like the lower frequencies you go, the more it gets delayed, which is how you get that hockey stick shape. I hope those diagrams and animations were helpful for understanding the intuition behind how I came up with this sound design technique, or at the very least, I hope you learned something about DSP. But that's it for the theoretical stuff. So let's jump into my Ableton sound design session. Here, this little channel is a resampled impulse, and it actually does not have any of these wiggly lines. That's Ableton trying to interpolate between the signal. So really what's actually fed into Ableton is these dots. Those dots are the samples, And you can see it goes immediately from its peak down to the zero crossing, and Ableton is just trying to interpolate and saying this is maybe what the signal would look like if we were to oversample it. Yeah. So we have the impulse going in, and where we left off was we had disperser. I kind of, I kind of lied before. It wasn't just one disperser, but just kind of baby steps towards the sound. Really, I have a series of disperser where each disperser is tuned to a different octave. But yeah, I don't have to open all these up. You can see it's, D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and so on up to, I think, D9. And then what I've done is I've essentially have this dispersion amount mapped to all these macro knobs. So each disperser, I can essentially each octave of frequencies, I can disperse a different amount. So let me solo this. Yeah, so this like low one, if we do less dispersion of the lows, we get less of that hockey stick shape. And if we do more, we get even more of that hockey stick shape. And yeah. As you turn all these up, you sort of get that laser effect. But especially in the high frequencies, turning this down gets us something more usable for a kick drum. So the next thing I want to do is essentially, let's think of this as colorizing the light. Like pure white light is actually really harsh and abrasive to look at. It's like a hospital room, right? So what I'm going to do is essentially add a bandpass filter tuned to our root note, 36.9. I think that's D1. So if we enable that, we also get quite a bit of gain. I apologize if it was quiet before. This is where a lot of the gain was coming from. So yeah, we have a bandpass filter, and then this low pass filter, I mean, the bandpass is already cutting some lows, but something I've noticed is, I mean, like truly every frequency is present in the impulse. So if we were to not cut the lows and we do something like this, see how you start getting like the inaudible frequencies like folding in? You get some like weird effects. So this high pass filter, mostly, let's maybe turn that up. If we try turning that up even more, it at least mitigates a little bit that problem of the, yeah, I mean, it pretty much mitigates the problem of the inaudible frequencies kind of folding in to the resonant tail of our kick drum. And we don't need to have such a long kick tail. That would probably be a pain to mix in the type of music I make, but maybe in the type of music you make, that's what you're going for. So yeah, this pinch knob, especially in the low frequency, kind of controls the sustain of the sound. I don't know. This kick's probably going to sound like shit after I've messed with the parameters, because I'm kind of just messing around. But you can kind of get infinite kicks by just tuning these knobs differently. Not that you couldn't already get infinite kicks by using something like Kick 2 and just playing with the pitch contour, but this is kind of a neat, it's almost kind of like a physical modeled type of system. I mean, the physical model of a disperser, I don't know if I should bring more physics into this video, but it'd be kind of like maybe a really long interconnect or a really long channel where you actually do get phase dispersion. But yeah, it does. I think there is some sort of physicalness to this circuit, this process. So yeah, that's sort of color. I would call that like colorizing the light, making the light warmer into our prism, kind of giving it a black body temperature. So lastly, at the end of the chain, I find it's also nice to put a bandpass on, which was disabled, but let's turn that back on. So I have a bandpass with a really low Q. So it's kind of acting more like a high pass filter, I suppose. Just cutting off some of the highs. Yep, let's saturate it. Which this amount of saturation is a little heavy before I'm layering samples. But after I layer in the sample, let's turn that drive back up. So yeah, over here in this group, this is kind of an interesting thing. If you see my Noisia kick tutorial, I show this trick, which I don't know if Noisia uses, but it was kind of my method for getting frequency content near the zero crossings of the kick sample, right around this point, and then sort of like squashing out the sample during the peaks of our fundamental. What I'm doing is I'm actually routing in audio 2 to this channel. So this is a clone of our fundamental. Maybe if we rename this fundamental, it's more clear. So I'm routing this in right here. I'm routing the fundamental into audio 4. So this is kind of like an auxiliary or a bus. And then basically I'm boosting the volume, low passing a little bit more the fundamental and this auxiliary copy. But then I'm going to get rid of it by high passing. So like, why am I doing that? It's because before I high pass, I'm going to saturate, which actually just on its own, before we add in the Rob Late Foley sample, is going to give us some crispy top end. So that's actually the overtones from this intense distortion making it through, but then the kind of like the lower parts of our fundamental being cut off. And I suppose, yeah, I mean, I think that's mostly how I describe what's happening. But then I think the really cool part is then when you layer in a sample before this saturation. So since these are grouped together, the fundamental and this Rob Late Foley sample are going to get distorted together, which will kind of like squash the Rob Late sample near the peaks of the fundamental. And then when you remove the fundamental, it's just kind of flat during those parts. So this is a resampled version of the audio form. You can see maybe this technique isn't like perfectly phase aligned, or maybe something in like the Ableton latency. I have to refine that technique, but you can see like you get these sort of clumps of noise. And the idea is if you put them near the zero crossing, you optimize your headroom for this sample. Whoa, zoomed way out. Yeah, so the last thing I wanted to show you is layering samples with this technique. It makes a huge difference, but yeah, that's just what I really like about this parallel distortion with the auxiliary copy of the fundamental. It really mixes in really cleanly. Like you can throw pretty much any sample into this and it's going to blend pretty nicely. Like, yeah, I think you can't go wrong with this. Like, you're just going to end up with many, many nice kicks. In fact, it's almost dangerous. I probably am never going to finish another song because I already struggle with finishing songs, and now I just have a new sound design technique. So yeah, I guess that's most of the sound. The only other thing to mention is I do have some stereo widening using this comb filter in stereo mode. Nice properties about using the comb filter in stereo. When you sum to mono, essentially the stereo stuff just cancels out, but your kind of original signal is maintained, maybe just a little less volume. Oops. Yeah, so just adding a little bit of stereo width to this kick and just in the top end since we're filtering it. And like I said, after you add the sample in, you could play with a little more saturation, and this is really more for mixing. Like the tone is totally fine down here, but it will probably be taking up more headroom. It's kind of small here. Let's zoom in on the scope. Whoa. Yeah, You can see like this is kind of more the shape of a kick I look for, just for basically for mixing purposes. But it's got to sound good first. Like use your eyes and your ears. Just use your brain to mix. Yeah, so I think that's pretty similar to the kick I started out with, but you know, it's also entirely different because different sample, different settings on this disperser, infinite possibilities. So that is the video. Thanks for making it to the end. If you found it useful, please do give it a like. It really helps out. And if you want to see more content like this, follow along with the channel. I've been sort of alternating each week between sort of like straightforward, just like, you know, here's a very usable synth patch. And then on other weeks, I do stuff like this where I kind of use my sciencey electrical engineering background to really dive into the DSP and hopefully teach something kind of academic along the way. That's kind of my passion. So I really like making these videos. So I'd really like to hear if, you know, you do also enjoy these videos. That'd be great to hear. But also if it's not your cup of tea, let me know. It'd also be useful for me to know as I'm sort of starting up this channel and trying to make content that you guys would like. So yeah, let me know in the comments. See you next time.